My name is Elena, and I am 53 years old. For the most part, my life is quiet and predictable, days filled with the comforting hum of routine. Mornings are spent with a cup of tea by the window, watching the world outside as it wakes. Afternoons often find me at the small bookstore I've managed for years, lost in the familiar scent of old pages and whispered conversations with customers. But it was a Thursday afternoon when my carefully arranged life shifted in the most unexpected way. I remember it clearly, a day bathed in the golden glow of autumn, the air crisp and filled with the faint aroma of falling leaves. I decided to stop by a quaint little cafe near the park, a place I had visited countless times before, but that day was different. I had just settled at a table by the window, a novel in one hand and a steaming cup of chamomile tea in the other, when I saw him. He walked in with a casual confidence, his dark hair slightly windswept, his coat hanging loosely over his broad shoulders. He couldn't have been more than 30, yet there was something about him, a quiet intensity, an air of thoughtfulness, that held my attention. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing moment of admiration, a harmless distraction. But as he ordered his coffee and took a seat 2 tables away from mine, I found myself stealing glances. His presence filled the room in a way that was almost magnetic. He sat with his back straight, his gaze focused on a notebook in front of him. Occasionally, he would look up, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. My heart quickened every time his gaze drifted in my direction, though I told myself I was imagining things. I couldn't explain it, but something about him stirred a feeling within me that I hadn't felt in years. It was as though he had unlocked a door I didn't even realize was closed, and behind it was a part of me that had long been dormant. When he left the cafe that day, I felt an inexplicable pang of loss. I watched him walk down the street, his stride purposeful yet unhurried, and before I even realized what I was doing, I found myself following him. For the next 3 days, I became a quiet observer of his life. I watched as he bought flowers from a street vendor, his smile warm and genuine as he thanked the elderly woman who wrapped the bouquet. I saw him sit on a park bench, scribbling in his notebook with a furrowed brow, lost in thought. I even spotted him at the grocery store, carefully choosing a bottle of wine as though it was meant for a special occasion. Each moment revealed a little more about him, yet left me with more questions than answers. Who was he? What kind of life did he lead? And why, after so many years of solitude, had he awakened something in me that felt so urgent, so impossible to ignore? I didn't know what I was searching for or what I hoped to find. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, my world felt alive again. By the 4th day, I was certain he had begun to notice me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, that he was glancing around out of habit, not looking for me. But then there were moments I couldn't dismiss, fleeting yet unmistakable. That morning, I returned to the cafe where I first saw him, hoping to blend into the background with my usual tea and book. When he walked in, the air seemed to shift, and I froze, unsure whether to look up or bury my face in my novel. But he noticed me. His gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary before he ordered his coffee. My heart raced. Was it a coincidence? Was he simply being polite? He took a seat by the window, just across from me. I couldn't concentrate on my book. Every part of me was hyper-aware of his presence. As I gathered my courage to glance his way, I found his eyes already on me. He quickly looked away, but not before a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The moment left me breathless. Could he really be noticing me, or was I letting my emotions cloud reality? The next day, I saw him at the park, sitting on the same bench as before, his notebook resting on his lap. I had gone there to clear my head, hoping to make sense of the emotions that had overtaken me, but there he was again, as though the universe had conspired to bring us together. I tried to act natural, sitting a few benches away, but his presence seemed to pull at me like a magnet. I told myself not to look, not to give in to the growing curiosity that threatened to expose me. Yet, when I finally dared to glance his way, I caught him watching me. This time, he didn't look away. He held my gaze, his expression soft and inquisitive, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, and I quickly turned away, pretending to be fascinated by the pigeons pecking at crumbs nearby. The coincidences continued, each one more unsettling and thrilling than the last. At the grocery store, I saw him again. He was in the wine aisle, studying the labels with the same deliberation I had observed before. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn and walk away, but before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. This time he smiled fully warmly, and my breath caught. "We seem to keep running into each other," he said, his voice deep and smooth. I managed to smile, though my mind was racing. "I guess we do," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The conversation was brief, just a few polite remarks about the unpredictability of coincidences, but his eyes held mine the entire time, and I felt something shift between us. As I left the store that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like the universe was weaving our paths together, daring me to take a step I never would have considered before. For the first time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had noticed me all along. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to convince myself to let it go, to retreat back into the safety of my routine and forget about him. But every time I thought of his smile, his voice, or the way his eyes lingered on mine, I felt something deep within me stir, something too powerful to ignore. I had never considered myself a bold woman. Life had taught me to stay within the lines, to avoid risks and heartbreak. But now, I felt like a woman on the brink of rediscovery, standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it might feel like to jump. It was a Friday evening when I made the decision. The air was crisp, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air, and I found myself pacing in my kitchen, rehearsing what I might say. My hands trembled as I smoothed my dress, a simple navy piece that I hadn't worn in years, hoping it didn't look too outdated. I had to see him again. I had to know if the connection I felt was real. I went back to the cafe where we had first seen each other. I wasn't even sure he would be there, but as I stepped inside, I saw him sitting at the same table by the window. His notebook was open, a pen in hand, and he was lost in thought. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move. Before I could second-guess myself, I approached his table. He looked up, surprised at first, but then his lips curved into that familiar, gentle smile. "Hi," I said, my voice soft but steady. "Do you mind if I join you?" "Of course not," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. We talked for what felt like hours. He told me about his love for writing, his fascination with people and their stories, and the way he found inspiration in the little moments of everyday life. I told him about my bookstore, my love for literature, and the quiet life I had built for myself. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no judgment, only curiosity and warmth. When the cafe began to empty, I knew it was now or never. My hands were trembling again, but I clasped them tightly in my lap and took a deep breath. I know this might seem forward," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "But I'd like to invite you to my home. For dinner. If you're free tomorrow evening." He blinked, clearly surprised, but then his expression softened into something almost tender. "I'd like that," he said, his voice low and sincere. Relief and excitement flooded me all at once, but as I walked home that night, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. What if he thought I was foolish? What if I was making a mistake? Still, there was no turning back now. I spent the next day preparing, pouring my nervous energy into every detail. I set the table with my best dishes, cooked a meal I hadn't made in years, and lit candles that filled the room with a soft, golden glow. By the time the doorbell rang, my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he would hear it. I opened the door, and there he was, holding a bottle of wine and wearing that same disarming smile. "Good evening, Elena," he said, his voice warm and steady. For a moment, I just stood there, taking in the sight of him, the reality of what was about to unfold. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped aside and welcomed him in the atmosphere in my home felt charged the moment he stepped inside. I had spent so much time preparing every detail, perfecting the lighting, the arrangement of flowers on the table, the playlist of soft piano melodies playing in the background, but nothing could have prepared me for the way his presence filled the room. He handed me the bottle of wine, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "I hope this is okay," he said, his voice low and smooth. "It's perfect," I replied, though my heart was racing too fast to fully process the words. We moved to the dining table, the soft clink of plates and glasses filling the space as I served the dinner I had agonized over. Conversation flowed easily, like a current we both willingly drifted along. He shared stories from his life, his travels, his ambitions, the struggles of being a writer trying to carve out his voice in the world. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. I told him about the dreams I had buried beneath decades of practicality, about the woman I used to be before I let life convince me that certain parts of myself didn't matter anymore. His eyes never left mine. They were attentive, curious, and, most unexpectedly, filled with something that felt like admiration. When dinner was finished, we moved to the living room, the space lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle. The air between us had changed, growing heavier, more intimate. He sat close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and when he turned to face me, I could see the faint shadow of uncertainty in his expression, as though he was waiting for a sign. "Elena," he said softly, his voice wrapping around my name like a secret. "I don't want to overstep, but there's something about you. Something I can't quite explain." My breath caught. I had spent so much time worrying about what he might think of me, of my age, my insecurities, the gap between our worlds, but in that moment, all of it seemed to fade. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against his. "You're not overstepping," I whispered. His hand closed over mine, firm yet gentle, and before I could think, he leaned closer. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like the first notes of a melody we were both learning to play. But it quickly deepened, growing urgent and unrestrained, as though we had been waiting for this moment far longer than either of us realized. Time seemed to blur as he pulled me closer, his hands tracing the lines of my face, my shoulders, my back. Every touch felt electric, igniting parts of me I thought had been extinguished long ago. It wasn't just the physicality of it. It was the way he looked at me, as though he saw me not as a woman defined by years or experiences, but simply as a woman. It was the way his touch spoke of reverence, of longing, of unspoken truths that neither of us could put into words. As the night unfolded, I let myself surrender to the moment, to the connection that had drawn us together despite every reason it shouldn't have. For the first time in years, I felt alive in the purest, most vulnerable sense. And when we finally rested, the room bathed in the soft glow of morning light filtering through the curtains, I realized I hadn't just found him. I had found a piece of myself I thought I had lost forever. I woke to the golden light of morning spilling across the room. The world outside seemed distant, muted, as if it had paused to allow me this moment. For a few seconds, I stayed still, unsure if the warmth beside me was real or just a fragment of some dream. But then I felt his arm draped lightly over my waist, his steady breathing close to my ear. He was real. This was real. I turned slightly, careful not to wake him. His face was peaceful, the lines softened in sleep. The sight stirred something deep inside me, a quiet ache that was equal parts joy and disbelief. How had I ended up here, in this fragile yet perfect moment? Memories of the night before washed over me in vivid detail. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way every hesitation and doubt melted away the moment we came together. It had been more than just passion. It was something raw and deeply human, something I hadn't felt in years. For a long time, I stayed there, watching him, my thoughts tumbling over themselves. What did this mean? Was this just a fleeting moment, a beautiful but temporary escape from the boundaries of my life? Or could it be something more? When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, he smiled at me in a way that made my heart skip. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. For a while, we just lay there, the silence between us warm and unhurried. It felt strange, yet natural, as though we had known each other far longer than the brief days since we'd first spoken. I didn't want this night to end, he said eventually, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. And now that it has, I don't want to leave. His words caught me off guard. I had prepared myself for polite goodbyes, for the possibility that this might be all there was. But the vulnerability in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, left me speechless. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "You don't have to leave," I said softly. "Not unless you want to." His smile widened, and for the first time in years, I felt something akin to hope take root in my chest. The day passed in a blur of quiet moments, coffee at the kitchen table, laughter over a forgotten loaf of burnt toast, shared stories about our lives that felt like puzzle pieces falling into place. But beneath it all, I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my mind. What would people think? What would this mean for him, for me? Could this really work, or was I simply indulging in a dream that would inevitably end? That night, as we sat together on the couch, the glow of the setting sun painting the room in hues of amber, I found the courage to voice my fears. Whatever this is, I began, my words faltering. It's not something I ever expected. And I can't help but wonder, does it make sense? Do we make sense? He turned to me, his expression steady and calm. "Elena," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "since when does love make sense? It's not about logic or expectation. It's about feeling alive, about finding something or someone that makes everything else fade away." His words lingered in the air, wrapping around me like a promise. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I was willing to step into the unknown. It's strange, isn't it? How life can go on for so many years, so many days, and then one day, you find yourself standing at the edge of something entirely new, something you never thought you'd allow yourself to experience. I've spent so much of my life following rules, sticking to the safe path, doing what was expected. But with him, I've discovered that life isn't something to just endure. It's something to be felt, something to be embraced fully, even when it doesn't make sense. The days after he stayed were a whirlwind of emotions. The connection between us grew deeper, more intimate, and more undeniable. We talked endlessly about everything and nothing, our conversations weaving between lighthearted banter and serious, heart-opening discussions. But it wasn't just the talking. It was the way he made me feel. The way his presence filled the spaces in my life that had once felt hollow. He looked at me as if I were a part of the world, not a relic of it. And for the first time in years, I felt as though I mattered, not just as someone's wife, someone's mother, but as me. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There were times when I caught myself thinking about the inevitable whispers of society, the judgment that would surely follow when people learned about us. I wondered if we were being reckless, if this was all a fleeting passion that would eventually fade. But then, I would look at him, and all those doubts would vanish. His eyes, his smile, his touch, all of it reminded me that love has no rules. It doesn't care about age or timing or what other people think. I've come to realize that this connection, this unexpected bond we've formed, isn't about defying the world. It's about finding the courage to be true to ourselves. To step outside the boundaries we've created for ourselves and to live authentically, even if it means risking everything we've known. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know where this will go, or what obstacles we'll face. But for the first time in my life, I am no longer afraid of the unknown. I've spent so many years being careful, being measured, but now I'm learning to live with an open heart. And that's enough. When I look at him now, I see not just a young man, but a partner, a friend, a mirror reflecting the woman I was always meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, I am at peace with who I am, flawed, complicated, and beautiful in my own way. This love, this experience, it has been a turning point for me, a journey back to myself. And I have no intention of turning back. As I close my eyes tonight, I know that I found something precious, not in him, or in anyone else, but in myself. And for that, I will always be grateful. This is not the end, but the beginning of something entirely new. And for the first time, I'm ready to embrace it.